I was born in 1924 in Germany, and I lived in a village in the Black Forest of Germany, southwest Germany, where my father's side of the family had lived for several generations. But before I'm going to tell you my story, I would like to introduce you to some members of my family because I will be talking about some of them later on. These are my grandparents on my father's side of the family. These were my great-grandparents. These are my grandparents, my father's parents. This is my grandfather, my mother's father. This is my grandmother, my mother's mother, my mother, my father. And this photograph was taken in August 1937 when my grandmother, who's sitting in the middle of this photograph, had her 75th birthday. And yours truly is to your right with the one with the bow on her dress. I was 13 years old at that time. When Hitler came to power in 1933, I was 8 years old. And I remember hearing my parents and other adults talking about Hitler. At first they were saying they hoped he wouldn't come to power. And after he came to power, they were saying they hoped he wouldn't remain in power very long. And I heard all of that, but I didn't really think it had anything to do with me. It was just some adults talking a lot of nonsense. But just 2 months later, on Saturday, April 1st, 1933, I realized that it did indeed have something to do with me, because on that day, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses all over Germany. And my father and his younger brother had a business that my great-grandfather, the man that you saw in the first photograph, started in 1858. And there was a Nazi standing in front of our store, in front of the Jewish hardware store, the Jewish butcher, the Jewish baker. This photograph, which was not taken in our village, shows what that boycott looked like. This was perhaps a larger store because there are 3 Nazis standing in front of that business. The sign on the right says anyone who shops in a Jewish store is a traitor to the fatherland or a traitor to Germany. And I remember asking my father, you know, what is this all about? Why is this man, this Nazi, standing in front of our store? And my father said, you know, don't worry about it. It's just going to be today, and it's nothing you need to be concerned about. And I really wasn't, because my father was right. There were no Nazis standing in front of Jewish businesses after that April 1st, 1933. I attended the public school in the village for the first 4 years of my school life. And in 1935, my parents decided that I should go to school in a neighboring community because the educational level in that school was higher than in the grade school that I had attended. And I went with my father to be enrolled when the principal said, I'm sorry, but Hedy cannot come to school here because you're Jewish. And my father didn't say anything, but he pointed to a pin that he wore in his lapel of his jacket. And the principal said, oh, excuse me, I did not know that you are a wounded veteran of World War I. In that case, Hedy can come to school here. I learned much later that there was a quota for children whose father was a wounded veteran of World War I, and they were allowed to attend that school. Others were not. And this is a photograph of the second school that I attended. This is another photograph of the same school. And when I attended the public school in the village, I never had any problems with either students or teachers. And the first year in this second school, I also didn't have any problems. But by the second year, some of my classmates no longer talked to me, or if they did say something to me, it was to call me dirty Jew or some other such ugly word. And I had the great misfortune, the last 2.5 years that I was in that school, I had a math teacher who was an SS man. The SS were the Nazi stormtroopers, the Nazi elite, and he came to class almost daily wearing his black SS uniform, knee-high black boots, and in his right boot he usually carried a revolver. And when he asked me questions, he sometimes would have his hand on the revolver, or at other times he actually pointed it at me. And when he asked me questions, and no matter what my answers were, whether they were right or wrong, he would ridicule me and in front of my classmates, and he would say, "That's a Jewish answer." And we all know that Jewish answers are no good. I was so afraid of this man. Is he going to shoot me? Is he going to kill me? That I actually was not able to learn. And even today, I still have problems with very simple arithmetic problems. When I spoke in that school several years, when I spoke at that school, someone took a photograph of me leaning up against this pillar, which was one of the pillars in front of the school building. And during recess, I used to stand there all by myself, watching how the other children played with each other, talked to each other, but nobody would have anything to do with me. And so I would just stand there by myself. Several years ago, I was invited to speak to the students at this school. And I told them the same story that I just related to you. And one of the students said, pointing to one of the students, and he said, "That student back there knows how to draw. Why don't you tell him what the teacher looked like, and he can draw him on the blackboard?" And that's what he's doing. Now he gave on this picture, he gave the teacher also a whip, which the teacher fortunately didn't have. And so I said, well, now the teacher is present even more than before. What are we going to do about this? And the same 13-year-old student said, "Why don't you pick up the sponge, step back from the blackboard, and throw the sponge at this picture and see if you can wipe it out." And I did, but I didn't quite succeed in wiping it out altogether. And so I handed the sponge to the 13-year-old, and he tried, and so did some of the other students. And finally, there was still a little bit left of the drawing. And so the 13-year-old suggested that I pick up the crayon or the chalk and scratch out the picture. And I did that, and all kinds of feelings came out that I didn't even know I had. That was in 1935. Another thing also happened in 1935, in October of 1935. My grandfather, my mother's father, lived in a city some distance from where we lived. And one day he was walking on the sidewalk when a Nazi came up to him and said, "Get off. Jews are not allowed to walk on the sidewalk." And so he walked in the street. And the same Nazi said, "But Jews are not allowed to walk in the street either. Come with me, you're under arrest." And with that, he was taken to one of the town's awful jails. After spending several days in that jail, he was told, "If you promise to give up your home, give up your business, leave town and never come back, we'll release you." And since he wanted so desperately to get out of this awful jail, He made that promise, but now he no longer had a place to stay. He no longer had a source of income. And so he came to live with us. And at first I thought that was wonderful, having Grandpa with us every single day, until I found out why he was staying with us and why he was so very unhappy. He spent several months with us, and then when he felt it was maybe too much for my family, he moved on to his son and daughter-in-law who lived in another city, stayed with them for several months, and then moved on to a Jewish old age home, spent several months there, and then he came back to us, spent a few months with us, and then went on to my uncle and aunt, and so on. I now want to move on to November 9th and 10th, 1938. That period has been referred to as Crystal Night, or the Night of the Broken Glass. And what I'm going to tell you was what my memory is of that period. But what happened to me, what I know, is similar to what happened to Jews wherever they lived in Germany and Austria. Austria had already been annexed to Germany at that time. And I remember leaving for school on November 10th, just like any other morning. It was a very sunny but also very cold morning. And as on my way to school, I passed the home and office of a Jewish dentist. And all the windows in that building were broken. I didn't know why, but I assumed it is because the family is Jewish. But I continued on to school. Classes started punctually at 8. At about 8:30, the principal walked into our classroom and he talked to all of us. And then he suddenly stopped and he pointed his finger at me and he said, "Get out, you dirty Jew." And I heard what he said, but I just could not believe that this man, who I thought was a very kind, gentle person, his daughter was one of my classmates, that he would say something like this. And so I asked him to repeat it, and he did. But he also came over and he grabbed me by the elbow and shoved me out the door. As I stood out in the hallway, I was wondering, what happened? Did I fall asleep? Did I not pay attention? What am I going to tell my parents? And before I could answer those questions, if indeed there were answers to them, some of my classmates came running out of the classroom, put on their coats and jackets. Some pushed or shoved me, others called me Dirty Jew and some other names, and they all left. Where were they going? I had no idea. And so I went back in my classroom, sat at my desk, got out a book, and tried to study, when a few minutes later there was a soft knock on the door. And in came the only other Jewish child in that school, a boy by the name of Hans Dolacher. Hans was a year younger than I and in a class below me. And he had pretty much the same experience as the one that I just described. And so he said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "Hans, go back to your classroom, sit at your desk and study, just like I'm doing." But Hans said, "No, I'm scared. Can I stay here?" And I said, "Sure, you can stay here, but please be quiet because I'm trying to study." And then Hans said, "Well, can I go over to the window and look out?" And I said, "Yes, you can do that, but please be quiet now." And so Hans stood by that window maybe an hour or an hour and a half when he suddenly became very excited. And he said, "Come here, look." And what we saw were men and boys, 4 in a row, chained to each other, to the ones in front of them, chained to the ones behind them, with SS accompanying them and hitting them with whips and urging them to walk faster. We didn't know who these men and boys are, but we assumed that they are Jewish men and Jewish boys. And so we decided to call home to find out what's going on. There was a bookstore right next to the school where we used to buy our school books, but there was also a phone there that we could use. And I called my mother at home, and a strange voice answered the phone and said, "The phone is no longer in service." I called my father at his place of business. I called my grandmother, my aunt, and each time the same voice told me the phone is no longer in service. Hans called his mother and some other people, and he too was told the same thing. And so we decided to leave school and go home and find out what's going on. As I approached my home, I noticed it looked different than the way it did when I left in the morning for school. You'll notice on this photograph, the shutters are closed on the second floor, but they're open on the first floor. When I left for school that morning, the green shutters were open. They were always open during the daytime. But when I came home later that morning, the green shutters were closed. I ran to the doorway, and it was locked. And I rang the doorbell, and no one answered. And so I stood in front of the building for a few minutes, trying to figure out, why is everything different today? Why does nothing make any sense? When I saw a man walking towards me, and I knew he was one of the village's worst Nazis. And any other time earlier, if I found myself on the same side of the street as he, I would cross over to the other side because I was afraid of him. But that morning, in my dismay, I went over to him and I asked him, "Do you know where my mother is?" And his response was, "I don't know where the goddamn bitch is, but if I find her and if she's still alive, I will kill her." And with that, I just took off as quickly as I could. On my way, I passed a Jewish hardware store. The two display windows were broken. There were people milling around, laughing and joking, and some of them were reaching into the broken windows and taking out merchandise, which I also did not understand. But I continued on, and as I got close to where our business was and where my aunt and uncle lived, I saw my mother and my aunt looking out of this window here. By the way, our business used to be right here, and where you see this white stripe, there used to be the name of our business, but somebody had whitewashed it. And by the way, I took these photographs of the home where I lived and this one in August of 1947, which was the first time that I was back in the village. And my mother opened the door, and she looked kind of grotesque. She was taller and thinner than my aunt, but she wore one of my aunt's dresses. And we exchanged what each of us experienced since we last saw each other earlier that morning. And my mother told me that about 10 minutes after I left for school, some Nazis came to the house and they arrested my father. He was still in his pajamas. They did not give him an opportunity to get dressed or even to put a coat on this very cold morning. And as he was being walked out the door, he said to my mother, "Try to find Hedy, try to stay together." A couple of the Nazis stayed behind, and they broke the windows in the building, some furniture, and some of the dishes. After they left, my mother closed the shutters because that was the only way she could secure the windows, locked the door, and ran down to my aunt's house, not realizing she was still wearing her nightgown. And that's why my aunt gave her one of her dresses to wear. The reason they were looking out of this window, and I joined them, is because they heard that earlier that morning, all Jewish men and boys beginning with the age of 16 had been arrested and had been taken to Village Hall, which was in the next block this way and on the other side of the street. And they were hoping, or we were hoping, to see the men and boys come out of Village Hall and come back home soon. It wasn't long after I arrived at my aunt's house that we saw a group of people coming out of Village Hall, and they were being marched right past where my aunt lived. And it was exactly the same sight that I'd seen earlier that morning. We saw 4 men in a row chained to each other, to the ones in front of them, to the ones behind them, accompanied by SS, who were hitting them with whips and urging them to walk faster. But in this group was my father, my uncle, and many others that I knew. And my mother practically hung me out of this second-story window and called out to my father, "We have Hedy, we're together." Whether he heard or saw me, we didn't really know. And we watched them until they went around the bend in the road, and then they were out of sight. Where were they going to? We had no idea. When would they be coming back? There was no answer to that either. And so we closed the window and we sat there sort of in numb silence. And a few minutes later, there was loud banging on the door downstairs. When my uncle was arrested earlier that morning, nobody did any damage to the building. But knowing what happened where we lived, we decided to run up into the attic and hide in an old abandoned wardrobe there. And I remember whispering to my mother, "I want to get out of here, but not just out of this wardrobe. I want to get out of Germany." And I guess the reason I said I want to get out of Germany is because I knew my parents had tried for several years to leave Germany, but we were not successful. How long were we in that wardrobe? I didn't know that day, and I certainly don't know today, but it seemed like an eternity to me, like I spent my entire life in there. When it was quiet for quite a while, we decided that it was probably safe to come downstairs. And it was. There was nobody there, and only very little damage had been done to the building. We learned later on that the people who were doing the vandalizing were told to stop at noon and move on to the next village and do exactly the same thing there. And it was probably 1 or 2 minutes before noon when they came to my aunt's house. There were many other things that happened on that day and in the next several days. For instance, Jewish children were no longer allowed to attend either public or private schools. Jewish businesses that were still functioning were permanently closed. If you were Jewish and a doctor or an attorney, you could no longer practice. Christian doctors were not allowed to treat Jews. Jews were not allowed to go to a hospital. The synagogues, the Jewish places of worship in Germany and Austria, most of them were burnt down to the ground. The synagogue in our village was set on fire, but they very quickly extinguished the fire because the houses on either side of the synagogue were Christian homes, and they were afraid that if they let the synagogue burn down, that these Christian homes will also catch fire. But 2 men climbed up on the roof, and they knocked down the 2 tables of Moses, which contained the 10 Commandments. There was a lot of damage done to the interior of the synagogue. The photograph on your right shows what the interior of the synagogue looked like before November 1938. The photograph on your left shows what it looked like, the interior looked like after November 1938. The two chandeliers that you see on the picture on your right were knocked down and they're lying broken on the floor. The benches from upstairs were thrown down and lying broken on the floor. In the back here, where the Torah scrolls were kept, the Torahs are the holiest of the holiest in Judaism. They contain the 5 books of Moses. The Torah scrolls are no longer there. Where were they? They were taken to Village Hall, where the men and boys were, and some of the men were wrapped in the Torah scrolls. Later on, before they were marched down the street, they were taken out of the Torah scrolls. But when they arrived, the men and boys arrived at the railroad station, the Torah scrolls were hung like curtains on the platform of the railroad station. In August 1947, when I was back in the village, the photograph on your left is what the synagogue looked like. I understand that a large agricultural firm purchased the building, and shall we say they remodeled it. They stored agricultural items in the building. In the late 1980s, thanks to the then mayor of the village and some other good people, it was decided to restore the synagogue to its former beauty. The interior was not restored at that time, but that happened several years later, though it does not look like it used to look. There was no information about the men and boys who had been arrested for 2 weeks. We had no idea where they were or if they were even still alive. And then 2 weeks after their arrest, a pre-printed postcard arrived to the families who had members that were arrested on November 10th. And the postcard came from the concentration camp Dachau. Dachau was the very first concentration camp that the Nazis built in 1933, right after they came to power. By 1938, there were several other concentration camps in Germany, such as Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, etc. And the printed part, or the pre-printed part on this postcard, gives all the do's and don'ts that you can't come and visit, etc. And it's signed by the camp commander. Once we knew where my father and the other men and boys are, my mother decided to visit the Nazi Secret Service office, or Gestapo office, which was in a town some distance from where we lived. And I begged my mother, please don't go, because if you go and they keep you, then I won't have a mother and I won't have a father. And my mother explained to me how very important it was for her to go, because maybe she can bring about the return of my father and some of the other men and boys, and maybe they come back even sooner. And so she left early every morning by train, came back late at night by train without any information until the Monday of the 4th week after the men and boys had been arrested. And on that day, she was told that my father would return home sometime this week. However, if he's not back by Friday, he will not ever return because he will no longer be alive. And on that same Monday, the first few men arrived back home. We heard about it and we visited them. But my mother did not allow me in the room when conversation took place because she felt I was still too young. I was 14 at the time. But one thing made an indelible impression on me. Every man and every boy that came back had his hair completely shorn off, and I had never seen anyone look like that before. On the next morning, on Tuesday morning, we went back to the house where we lived because that's where my father would, of course, come to. I forgot to mention that during this entire time we had stayed at my aunt's house because we could not get the windows replaced where we lived. My father did not come back home on Tuesday, not on Wednesday, nor on Thursday. And on Friday morning, I think my mother temporarily lost her sanity because she absolutely refused to get out of bed. She said, "My husband is dead. He will never come back home. There's no sense going on living." And my aunt and I tried to convince her how important it is for her to get up and go back to where we lived. But it was to no avail. And so I asked my aunt, "Please accompany me back to our house." And my aunt said, "I can't leave your mother in the condition that she's in. You can go by yourself and you don't need to be afraid." And I said, "But I am afraid. I'm not going by myself." And a few minutes later, there was a knock on the door downstairs. And for the first time in 4 weeks, I did something on my own. I went to the window and looked out, and I called out, "Daddy's home." And my mother said, "No, no, no, it's the Nazis. Let's go back up in the attic and hide in that wardrobe." But I went downstairs and I opened the door, and there indeed stood my father. You may remember I mentioned earlier when he was arrested, they took him in his pajamas. He was now fully dressed. He even had a hat. And when I opened the door, he removed his hat. And I said, "Oh my God, they shaved your hair." Now, I'd seen all the other men and boys that came back earlier that week with their shaved heads, but this was my father, and I thought that he would be different. But of course, he wasn't. And he was so ashamed when I said they shaved your head that he put his hat back on. But he not only put it on, but he pulled it all the way down as far as he could. It took quite a while before my mother realized that the man standing next to her bed is her husband, is my father. But once she came around and recognized him, she urged him to take his clothes off, wash up, and put on some clean clothes. And he was very reluctant to do so and explained, "When I was in Dachau, I was beaten, and my body is sore and swollen. The clothes they gave me fit real tight, and if I take them off, it's just really going to hurt a lot more." And so my mother got a pair of scissors and she cut open the sleeves of his jacket and sort of peeled him out of that jacket. They both went to the bathroom. I did not go along, so I don't know how bad his body really looked. But later that day, my father had what was probably a mild heart attack. And as I mentioned earlier, Jewish doctors were no longer allowed to practice. There was no Jewish doctor in the village anyway. And Christian doctors weren't allowed to treat Jews, nor could Jews go to a hospital. But our family doctor, Dr. Weber, a Christian, literally risked his life and maybe that of his family, because late at night, every night, he came to our home and he took care of my father as best as he could until my father was relatively well again. I want to also tell you another side of Dr. Weber. Several years ago, I was back in the village and gave a talk, much like this one, only I gave it in German. And Dr. Weber's sister was in the audience, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, "Did you know my brother died in 1953? And I said, "No, I did not, and I'm very sorry to hear that." She told me he was in the army during the war. So when I came back to St. Louis, I did some research, and I found out that Dr. Weber not only was in the army, but he performed medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. So this really demonstrates the two sides of human beings. Here is Dr. Weber, who risked his life and that of his family in 1938 and took care of my father, came to our house late at night to do that. And then during the war, he performed medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. Though it's not just Dr. Weber, but each of us has the possibility to do good and to do evil things. And we got to be very much aware that there is that possibility and make sure that we never, ever do these evil things. After my father recovered and was relatively well again, the efforts to leave Germany were resumed. But the focus changed a bit. Until then, we had hoped to leave as a family unit, but it was now decided that if one of us has the opportunity to leave, then that person will leave, and hopefully the others can follow soon thereafter. And the opportunity to leave Germany came for me in May 1939. I left Germany on May 18, 1939, on a kinder transport, or a children's transport, to England. England took in almost 10,000, mostly Jewish children from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, and would have taken more except the war broke out. The transport that I was on consisted of about 500 children, ranging in age from twins, 6 months old. The oldest were 17. I was 14 and a half. I wore this tag on a string around my neck as my identification. I was child number 5,580. We all went to England. Some of us were placed in foster homes, others in institutional settings, and the oldest ones, I understand, were sent on farms and were doing agricultural work. I stayed with a foster family, and a couple of days after I arrived, I began school for the first time since November 1938, when I was unceremoniously kicked out of school by the principal. I didn't understand a word because I spoke no English. I remained in touch with my parents we exchanged letters and postcards until England declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. Then you could correspond no longer directly. However, you could send 25-word messages through the Red Cross, and that's how we stayed in touch with each other. On October 22nd, 1940, all the Jews from that section of Germany where I come from, southwest Germany, were deported to a camp in what was then Vichy, France. France was occupied by Germany already, but the southern part of France seceded sort of from the rest of France and had its seat of government in the town of Vichy and called itself the Vichy government. And the Vichy government collaborated with the Nazis. This photograph, as well as the next 4 or 5 that I'll be showing, were supposedly secretly taken in the village where I come from on October 22nd, 1940, the day of the deportation of the Jews. The man in the black coat and hat is Mr. Auerbacher, and he's coming from his home, which is behind him, and he's going to be taken away on this truck. The man standing next to the truck is a German military man. This is the same man. His wife is behind him, and in the background you see some children watching. There's another family coming out of their home, The boy coming out of the gate here was at that time 10 years old. He's one of the very few that survived. His name is Meyer. He lives in Washington, D.C., and as far as I know, at this time, which is 2015, he's still working for the Library of Congress. His father is behind him. In front of him are his grandparents, and they're going to be taken away on that truck. There's a German soldier standing guard. There's a child watching, and there's some other people also watching. There's another man carrying 2 suitcases, getting ready to get on the truck. There are already some people on the truck. People were allowed to take 100 pounds of luggage with them, and I guess those 2 suitcases represent about 100 pounds of luggage. The other 2 men are German soldiers standing guard. There's another older woman struggling to get onto the truck. Somebody's reaching out a hand to her. And there's a German soldier standing guard. There's the next man ready to get onto the truck. On this map, you can see that, or I can show you that from this area, southwest Germany, is where the people from that area were deported on October 22nd to a camp called Contigurs, which is in the lower left corner of this map here. There were several camps along the border between France and Spain, which would be below where this map ends. Men and women were separated by barbed wire in the camp. It's perhaps an aberration of the war, because now my parents could correspond with me directly. However, they were allowed to write only 1 page per person per week. I could write as much and as often as I wanted to. My parents never ever told me about the horrendous conditions in the camp, how they froze during the winter, how they starved. This photograph was taken in the camp in Contigurs once a month, and early on, after their arrival, men and women were allowed to spend 1 hour together, and this photograph was taken on one of those occasions. Most of the people on this photograph are family members. My father is here, and there is my mother. This photograph was taken in the men's camp. There are about 40 men on here, and I can only identify my father here, my uncle, and an uncle of my father. All the others, I don't know who they are, but they're somebody's husband, father, son, cousin. In March of 1941, my father was moved from Contigurs to a camp called Camp-les-Milles, which is near Marseille, France. And then in July of 1942, my mother was moved from Contigurs to a camp called Camp de Rivesaltes, which is located approximately here, sort of in the middle between Contigurs and Camp-les-Milles. And then I received a letter from my father dated August 9th, 1942, in which he said, "Tomorrow I'm going to be deported to an unknown destination, and it may be a very long time before you hear from me again." And then I received a letter from my mother dated September 1st, 1942. The letter is in German, but I have translated it, and I would like to read some excerpts from this letter to you. And my mother writes on September 1st, 1942, "My dear good Hedy child, it is very difficult for me to write to you today, but there's no use, it has to be done. And then she talks about mail that she has received from me, and then goes on. The last few weeks have been very upsetting for all of us, but especially for me. Your father was deported from Colly Mill on August 12th, and unfortunately I don't know where he was sent to. The last mail I had from him was dated August 9th, in which he expressed the hope that somewhere en route we would meet because the transport from here left at the same time for an unknown destination. But I remained here because your father lately was a forced laborer. But now there is another transport leaving from here, and this time I'm leaving on it. My only hope is that I will still meet your father somewhere, and then we will carry our lot, no matter how difficult it may be, with dignity and courage. My dear good child, I will try in every way possible to remain in touch with you, but it will probably be a long time before we hear from each other again. And then she goes on later in the letter. Continue to be always good and honest. Carry your head high and never lose your courage. Don't forget your parents. And of course, I don't forget my parents. But I would like to ask each of you in the audience to remember at least one thing that I talked about today and share that with someone, especially someone who is young, and in that way, my mother's wish should never be forgotten, will be carried on long beyond the time that I am on this earth. And let me thank you for doing that. And then my mother writes, we shall continue to hope that one day we will see each other again, even if it takes a long time. My dear good child, let me greet you and kiss you heartily. I will never forget you and deeply love you. And then there was one more communication from my mother. A postcard dated September 4th, 1942. It's written in really shaky handwriting, and my mother says that she is traveling to the east, and she's saying a very final goodbye to me. Traveling, I didn't know that in 1942, that traveling to the east in September 1942 means you're probably traveling to Poland, to an extermination camp, and probably to your death. And both my parents had written, maybe a long time before I hear from them again. This is the reverse side of this postcard with a French stamp on it. And on the left-hand side here, where you would normally write your return address, it's blank. There's nothing there. Why? Because my mother had no return address. And since both of my parents said it may be a long time before I would hear from them again, I kept on waiting and wondering, how long is a long time? And then in 1956, I received 2 letters from a French organization dated 19th June 1956. One letter pertains to my father, the other one to my mother. And they both say that on the 11th of September 1942, they were sent to the concentration camp Auschwitz. I later learned that that date is correct for my mother. That's when she was sent to Auschwitz. My father was already sent to Auschwitz on the 19th of August, 1942. In September 1980, I went back to Europe to visit the various camps where my parents had been. And the last camp that I visited was Auschwitz. And when I stood on this spot in Auschwitz, where the cattle cars arrived, where the people were forced to get off, and the infamous Dr. Mengele made a selection as to who will live and who will die. When I stood on this very spot in September 1980, I finally was able to admit to myself that there is no way that my parents and other family members survived that time. In closing, I want to issue 3 challenges to you. One has to do with hatred, and hatred is a very ugly emotion, and it's destructive not only to the person or the group that you hate, but it's also very self-destructive. And hatred is what has led to Auschwitz. Hatred has led to what I've talked about. So and why do we hate? We hate out of ignorance. We hate the unknown. We hate people that look differently than we do, maybe have a different culture, speak a different language, or dress differently. And if you think you need to hate them because they don't look just like you, stop. And instead, make an effort to get to know them. There's a whole lot to be learned from people that are different than you. There's nothing to be learned from hatred. Hatred only destroys, and even destroys yourself. The second challenge has to do with choice or decision making. The Nazis made some choices and some decisions, and many of them were very bad decisions. And you make choices every single day. For instance, this morning, when somebody woke you up or when the alarm clock went off, you had to make a choice, and you were thinking, oh, it's such a miserable day outside. It's gray and rainy. I think I'm going to stay home and not go to school or not go to work. But you made a different decision, and you came here today. And I hope you made a good decision. I hope you think you made a good decision. And so as you go through the rest of your life, you will be making decisions. But before you act on those decisions, think about it. And is it a good decision? Or is it going to be destructive to somebody else, or maybe even to yourself? And then, if so, rethink it. And hopefully you'll make a better choice, a better decision. And the last challenge is, I'm firmly convinced that each and every one not only can, but must make a difference in life. And you may think you're too young or too old or too whatever. Nobody is too young or too old or too whatever it may be to make a difference. Because if each and every one of us takes on the responsibility to right the wrong that we see and that we experience, then maybe someday we can all live in peace and justice and harmony together. Thank you.